Thank you. Thanks, Paul, for inviting. This is a good opportunity. It's a good crowd. It's a lively topic, I think. So let's start off with the topic. So the idea is to review the labels from the FDA, not the EMA. Okay, so this is specific to the US for the last 5 years. And there was a poster presented at the ISPO, and there's a manuscript coming as well, which will be a little more detailed. So we will touch on some of the top line issues here, okay? And I want to thank you guys, by the way. I put the slides together and sent it off to Heather somewhere, sitting here somewhere, and then she did some magic, and it all looks really good. So it looks a lot better than what I thought it would be. So anyway, thank you, Heather. So some further acknowledgements for my colleagues, Carla DiMuro, Margaret Morden, Sherry Fennell, Linda Doward, and Emily Hadish. And I know that you probably don't know these folks and you probably don't care, but I do know them all and I care very much. Without their help, I couldn't have done this. So I would like to say thanks to them. So the purpose of the presentation today is really 3 topics. We'll define labels. You know, we talk about labelings and claims and label, and these are all slightly different things. So let's define labeling, and I'll sort of touch on to what's labeling and what's advertising as well. As much as I know, it's a very complicated topic. Then we will review the labels for the new drug applications. Okay, not all drugs, but simply the new drug applications for the last 5 years, 2011 to 15, and then we will compare them with the labels approved for 2006 to 10. Okay, so the last 5 years versus the 5 years before that. So we have data for 10 years, in fact, so we're looking at the last 5 versus 10, previous 5. Good. So what is labeling? Labeling is also known as various things in the industry. It could be prescription information, package insert. It is also called professional labeling, direction circular, or package circular. It all depends on who you talk to within the regulatory or within the medical field. So labeling is called various names. Okay? And the general requirements for prescription drug labeling, because there are devices labeling and nutritional labelings and all sorts of different labelings. And so this is prescription drug labeling. It must be a summary of efficacy and safety use of drug. Okay, safe and effectiveness use of drug. It must be informative and accurate. That kind of makes sense. It must not be promotional, false, or misleading. Okay, so you can only say what was proved. You can't take it any further. You can't say, for example, this drug lower the cholesterol. Sorry, if the drug is only for lowering cholesterol, you can't say it lowers cholesterol and therefore you will live longer or something along those lines. Same thing in cancer. If it shows tumor reduction, that's all you can say. You can't say it reduces your tumor and therefore you can live longer. Okay. So it must not be promotional, false, or misleading. No implied claims or suggestions for use of evidence of safety or effectiveness, based whenever possible on data derived from human experience. Okay, so that's the drug labeling. And labeling is any written, printed, or graphical material containing drug information and disseminated by or on behalf of the manufacturer of the drug. So that will be the sponsoring company that did the clinical trial. And for use by healthcare professionals. We sometimes mistake labeling thinking, oh, this is for consumers. That is not the case. Labeling is for healthcare professionals. So the primary purpose of drug labeling is not to inform patients about their medications. It's really for medical professionals. So here's an example of a package insert, and you would have seen this. Whenever you open a prescription, you will see this information that you cannot read. I mean, you don't even read what was on the bottle, let alone what's on this package. But this piece of sheet, I was going to say something else, sheet, I have to be careful with my accent and speed and so on. Anyway, this sheet can go to pages. Okay, it looks short now with lots of information, efficacy, safety, clinical trial information, contradiction, black box warnings, and all sort of things. It can go into pages. But advertisements, on the other hand, is any broadcast or through audio, video, visual media such as radio, television, and so on and so forth. Okay, so advertisement is much broader, and labeling is kind of everything else. Now, guys, it's much more complicated than this, and this is all I know. Labeling is very different from advertisements. Okay, labeling is very controlled. Advertisement takes a little bit further. So you can make some claims, but those claims must be agreed by the FDA. So here is an advertisement. Help for fibromyalgia pain can start with the Lyrica. So this is, again, this is an advertisement, and all the words that you see on the top, okay? Help for fibromyalgia pain can start with Lyrica. That's a claim that was agreed between Pfizer and the FDA. And this is, this advertisement, as you might guess, is based on patients' reported outcomes for pain and functioning. So requirement for advertisement and promotional labeling, claims must be consistent with the prescription information. So what you find in the package insert must be consistent with the advertisement. And it should not be false or misleading statement or omissions. Materials must be fairly balanced benefits and risks. Okay, so you can't just simply advertise what's only the benefits, but you must also say what the risks are. And that's why the printed advertisement that you see in People magazine or Reader's Digest or whatever, it can go on to like 2, 3, 4 pages sometimes. And it must be based on substantiated data. Okay, so here is an advertisement, and this is nothing new. We have seen these. I have often fallen victim for those that claim 6 packs in 3 days kind of thing. Obviously, it didn't work, as you can see. But this is not based on a clinical trial or anything like that. Okay, so it's okay, we can let it pass. But here is one of the most misleading advertisements ever, apparently. With Brooke Shields for Latisse. A few years ago, it was for eyelash, improvement of eyelashes, but one of the side effects was that if the medication touches somewhere else, then you start growing hair there too, and that wasn't mentioned in the promotional material. So it's supposed to be one of the most misleading commercial ever. So you're not going to rush out and buy this thing now. It's a local CVS or something like that, okay? Good. And here is a recent commercial, again, based on patients' reported outcomes for overactive bladder, urgency, frequency, and leakage, a very controlled experiment, a good commercial. You would have seen them in TV as well as in printed material. And this is the first of, I think, like 3 pages of advertisements, because they must balance the efficacy and the safety information. Okay. And here's another one by Bristol-Myers Squibb for Orencia for rheumatoid arthritis. And this is all based on, again, patients' reported outcomes, runs into pages. And as you can see, this is based on the questionnaire, health assessment questionnaire that has items like, can you open this, fasten this, shoelaces, and so on and so forth. Okay, so claims are very different from, labeling is very different from advertisements. Advertisements are also very well controlled. Okay, I think we are okay with that. Good. So now we switch to the real topic of the day, drug approvals between 2006 and 2010. So FDA approved 2016 drugs between new drugs between 2006 to 10. Okay, not 11 to 15, 6 to 10. And 24%, roughly a quarter of the new drugs had at least one PRO-based labeling. Now, there was a publication before that was published long before the PRO guidance that said there were about, I think, 33% of drugs, about 1 in 3 drugs had at least one PRO labeling. So there was a reduction of labeling, and this caused some waves, and we published this in 2012, a review of patients' reported outcomes labelings in the United States. So what I'm about to show you is the repeat of this work, but for 11 to 15. Okay. So drug approvals, 11 to 15. So the total number of new drug approved in between 11 and 15 is 182 new drug approvals. The number of new drugs with at least one PRO labeling was about 30, and that's about 16.5%. So in the previous 5 years, it was 24%, and now it's 16.5%. Right? So 16.5 versus 24.1. Obviously, in terms of percentages, there's been a reduction between 6 to 10 versus 11 to 15. Now, so this is kind of disappointing for those in the PRO field, and especially in the regulatory field, because everyone is talking about patient-focused drug development, and the PDUFA 5 encourages involvement of patients everywhere. So this was a bit of a surprise. Now, so we wanted to dig a little further into the data, and one of the things that you would notice is that the 2011 to 15 was based on 116 approvals, and 2006 to 10 was 182. Okay, so we wanted to look into this a little further. What we found was that there was a noticeable increase in the new drug applications for 3 disease categories. Cancer drugs went up by about 180%. Okay? Infectious diseases went up by about 100% or 90%. And endocrine and metabolic diseases approvals went up by about 115%, while all others went up by about 6%. Okay? So on average, there was an increase of 136% between the first 5 years and the second 5 years. And most of it was driven by either cancer drugs, infectious disease drugs, or drugs relating to endocrine and metabolic diseases. Now, what do we know about these 3 groups of drugs when it comes to patients' reported outcomes? Not a lot happens in terms of labeling, because cancer drugs are not dependent primarily on patients' reported outcomes data. I mean, patients' reported outcomes is there, but it's not used for regulatory decision making. Same thing with infectious disease. Most infectious disease applications are based on pathogen activities, CD4 counts, bacterial counts, and so on, not based on patients' reported outcomes. And endocrine and metabolic diseases like diabetes and so on, I mean, yes, there are PROs, but they are not used for regulatory decision making. So it's not surprising in some way that we don't, the number of PRO labels have gone down proportionally. So we went a little further. When I looked at the labelings for the 3 major diseases that we just talked about for 10 years, 6 to 15, there were only 5 labels, about 3% or 3.5%. When we looked at all other diseases, there were 53 labels, about 34%. Okay? So this is based on about 300 applications, new drug applications, and about 60 labels. So the hypothesis or the assumption or the belief that these 3 drugs don't yield much PRO labeling is kind of reasonable. So here's a commercial. Here's an advertisement for an HIV treatment. So this is infectious, well, you can say infectious disease. Our medication will not make you younger, sexier, or smarter. Okay? So right off the bat, they are saying, look, PROs are not the thing here. We don't really care what you do with this thing. Taken in combination with other HIV medication, we can lower your viral load. So the promotion is based entirely on viral load. Okay? They are not saying, look, if you want to be the best in the world of this, that, and the other, that's up to you. But we will get the viral load down. Okay? CD4 counts down. Very proud. But here's another commercial for Kybella a few months ago. This was for double chin. It's a very good case study. This needs some writing up. The patient's reported outcomes was a co-primary endpoint, and it was based on treatment satisfaction. Now, we always talk about proximal concepts and distal concepts, and we always think that the distal concept, patient satisfaction is a distal concept, and therefore there will be no labeling. But in this indication, what we usually consider as distal concept was a proximal concept. Okay, the questions were things like, I look prettier, I look less older than my age, and things of that kind, where the content validity can be very questionable. But that's what makes this product a success. Are you satisfied the fact that your double chin is no longer there? So it was a co-primary endpoint, a very good case study. So there were two categories of diseases we can postulate, if you like. Okay? One that depends on patients' reported outcomes, or traditionally depends on PROs to demonstrate treatment benefit. Traditionally. Going forward, that may not be the case, because lately there has been quite a few publications from the FDA insisting or sort of asking us to think about more PROs in cancer studies, for example, because patients with newer cancer therapies are living longer, and the differentiation between one therapy and the other is very little, and they want to see what the toxicity, what the side effects from a patient's point of view might be. So going forward, some of these assumptions may not stand, may not hold, but traditionally, there are drugs that are dependent on PROs for regulatory decision making, and there's a whole bunch of others, like infectious disease and endocrine diseases that not depends on PRO. So what we did was to go through ICD-10 classifications and said, okay, what are the sort of diseases that doesn't traditionally use PROs for clinical or regulatory decision making? Okay, so there's cancer, there's infectious and parasitic diseases, endocrine, nutritional and metabolic diseases, diseases of the circulatory system, where we talk about chronic heart failure, MI, the PhD. Then there are disease areas where there haven't been many drug approvals, like pregnancy, childbirth, symptoms and signs, and abnormal clinical and laboratory finding, injury, poisoning, suicidality, external causes of morbidity like transportational accidents and military operations. Okay? So these are the sort of disease area we thought that doesn't depend on patients' reported outcomes for decision making. So we grouped them. And there's a whole bunch of others that depends on patients' reported outcomes for decision making. Okay? Blood and blood-forming organs. What happens when we have problems with blood-forming organs? We have fatigue, tiredness. That's always patients' reported outcomes. Mental, behavioral, and neurodevelopment disorders like schizophrenia or anxiety disorders. Diseases of the nervous system, eye, ear, respiratory system, digestive system. Okay? Skin and subcutaneous systems. Musculoskeletal, like osteoarthritis and lupus and gout and rheumatoid arthritis. Genitourinary systems, erectile dysfunction, overactive bladder, dyspareunia, and so on and so forth. These are all pretty heavy PRO-dependent diseases. So if you guys, if your company is working in these disease areas, job security guys, you're okay. But if you're working on infectious diseases, maybe network later today. Okay. You might want to think about it. Okay, good. So there was a noticeable decrease in the percent of NDAs relating to PRO-dependent diseases. Okay, so when we look at the PRO-dependent diseases, in 2006 to 10, that's the blue bar, there were 42% of drugs. But now, the later years, there were 27% or thereabout. In the non-PRO-dependent, it was about 60% that went up to about 70%. Okay, so there's PRO dependent and PRO non-PRO dependent. So it's the same hypothesis as before. Instead of looking at just cancer and infectious diseases and the metabolic diseases, we sort of grouped the diseases by going through the ICD-10 code. And the assumption still holds. So PRO labeling was comparable, if we look at it, between the two disease areas if we take account of the PRO dependent and non-PRO dependent groupings. So if we take the first 5 and the second 5 years, in the first 5 years there were 28 labels between 2006 to 2010. Between 2011 and 15 there were 30 labels. So the number of labels between these two groups of 5 years were about the same. Okay, 28 versus 30. But the denominators were different. That's what was driving the percentage difference. Okay? But if we take the 23 of the 2006 to 10 as for the PRO dependent drugs and the 23 for the 2011 to 15 on the basis of PRO dependent drug, the percentages are about the same, about 47% versus 46%. Okay. So if we whereas before it was 24% versus 16% difference between the two groups of years, but if we take into account of what was actually approved, the type of drugs that were approved, the percent of labels hasn't changed much. Now, should it have improved? Should it be more? Maybe so. That's a different argument, I guess, or discussion. But it's not. The reduction wasn't there. It's about the same. So if we look at the PRO-dependent diseases between the entire 10 years, okay, and to see where things are happening. So if you have drugs for GI system, and I also have the number of drugs in the N parentheses as well. There was only one drug for things to do with ear, so we can leave that out. But nervous system, digestive system, musculoskeletal, blood and blood-forming organs, these are PRO heavy, if you like. Okay, especially the musculoskeletal system, 46% of the drugs had a PRO label. Now, should it be 80%? That's a reasonable argument. Okay, but we need to look into that a bit more further. Nervous system drugs mainly consisted of anti-epilepsy drugs, which relies on seizure rates reported by patients. Okay, so that's pretty heavy. Skin and subcutaneous, the derm division within the FDA only recently recognized the value of patients' reported outcomes. Okay, only from since the Cosentyx was approved for psoriasis, they start taking PRO seriously. So we might see when we look at the same sort of figures in the next 5 years, it is not 40% anymore. It might be 70 or 80%. Okay, things might change. So when we look at the non-PRO dependent drugs, again looking at the entire 10 years, you can see where things are. These are all few drugs, by the way. Okay, symptoms not classified elsewhere. This is usually symptoms due to chemotherapy. It's not due to cancer, but due to chemotherapy or some other, sort of secondary symptoms. Injury and poisoning, there were only 2 submissions, but if we look at something like the endocrine, nutritional, and metabolic diseases, there were 41 submissions, only 6. 41 submissions that led to about 4 labels, about 10%. Okay, infection and parasitic diseases. I think there was 1 drug. It's something to do with ear infection. Okay, cancer drugs. There was hardly anything in the new drug approval. I mean, we published a paper a few months ago in Journal of Clinical Oncology where we cited 2 labels for cancer drugs, but that's not based on new drugs. That was supplemental NDAs. Okay, so in summary, overall, labeling declined from 24% to about 16.5% between 2006 to 10 to 11 to 15. Okay, the number of new drugs approved that traditionally uses PRO-related endpoints was about the same between the 2 groups of 5 years. Okay, the number is about 49 and 50. And when we look at percentages, they were about the same too, 46% and 47% and 46%. Whether this is a good news or bad news, I'm not so sure. It's also very difficult to write this as a targeted message in a manuscript because there are different messages. People can take it whatever they want to. Oh, it's bad news because the percent of labels have gone down. That's there too. But if you miss the second bullet, then that would be unfortunate. So, but there are some observations as well, and we don't have, as I said, we don't have a great deal of time to go through them in detail, but I'll give you the bullets behind them, okay? Almost all labelings were for proximal concepts. So proximal, by that I mean symptoms or function. Now, I used to think that there was symptoms and then sort of problems with symptoms lead to problems with functioning as two separate things. One thing I realized over the last few years was that there are many diseases where functioning is the first order impact, not the symptom. So if we take, for example, irritable bowel syndromes or impact of chemotherapy, going to the bathroom, diarrhea, for example, I used to think that was a function because it's bowel movement. You think that was a function, but actually it's a symptom of that disease. So it's a symptom. Now, we can argue about that too, but what I'm trying to say is there's no such thing as sort of symptoms, function, and health-related quality of life and quality of life. I don't think there's a continuum there. I think symptoms and functions are the same. But nevertheless, most of the labels were for proximal concepts. There were a couple of exceptions. One was for Arcaptanio from Novartis, that the label was for health-related quality of life based on SGRQ, the St. George's Respiratory Questionnaire. It's what's called a useless label. Anyone want to guess why that would be a useless label? Because nobody knows in the US who St. George's is or what he got to do with anything to do with respiratory infections. And a 4-point reduction in SGRQ, the company couldn't promote it. There were quite a few labels that came out. I think there were 2 drugs that came out from the respiratory division. That's kind of what I call useless labels. So some labeling had limited value to the sponsors. All right. Most PROMs or PRO instruments were simple diaries or legacy instruments. So most of them were, it doesn't mean just because there were simple diaries, there wasn't any documentation or great deal of content validation that went behind it. What I'm trying to say here is that they were not multi-dimensional measures with different domains and total scores and et cetera, et cetera. Most were very simple diaries or legacy measures like the St. George's Respiratory Questionnaire, which leads to a useless label, or cystic fibrosis questionnaire that led to a very good label for Kalydeco, for cystic fibrosis. New measures are not always publicly available. Okay. Now, this is kind of interesting, especially for us who are in the sort of PRO domain, because we go to PR consortium meetings and we talk about sharing and all that sort of thing. We are all good citizens of the world, so if we develop something, we will immediately share it with someone else. That's not the case. You don't even find the publications behind some of these instruments anywhere. Okay, it's given to the FDA. FDA reads it, approves it, and it's not published at all. Okay, so one of the exceptions was the psoriasis symptom diary by Novartis, because Novartis wanted to publish it. I was at Novartis at that time, and I was wondering why we want to do this, because why do we want to give it to somebody else and save them 3 years of work and lots of money? But anyway, so new measures are not always available for publicly. And there were only few labelings were based on secondary endpoints. Okay, now this, again, guys, this is job security, okay? Because most of the labels are based on primary endpoints. Now, of course, if you have a drug that relies on patients' reported outcomes as the primary endpoint, everyone will be working overtime and during the weekends and make sure that you get that. Otherwise, you have no drug. So real innovation from HEOR or market access or wherever you guys might be comes from labelings based on secondary endpoints. And there were only 7 labelings based on secondary endpoints. That doesn't rely on the primary endpoint. Again, going back to the example of psoriasis, the primary endpoint was a clinician-reported outcome, PASI. I don't know what PASI stands for, but that's what it is, PASI. And the secondary endpoint, one of the secondary endpoints, was the psoriasis diary. The PASI went in the right direction, great. So you got the indication. Could we have got the indications without the patient's reported outcomes? I think so too, because it was a great drug. It works. But the psoriasis symptom diary also backed up the information. It gave the tailwind to the primary endpoint, which led to a label based on a secondary endpoint. And that was all done for the benefit of the US labeling. Nevertheless, there were only very few examples of labelings based on secondary endpoints. So, the final thought. This sounds like Jerry Springer show, doesn't it? I mean, with a final thought where you, no, you don't watch Jerry Springer show. No, you wouldn't. All right, okay. I work from home, so I watch it all the time. Followed by Ellen show and followed by, a whole bunch of people who come after. Anyway, there you go. Here's the final thought. There is the 21st Century Act recently passed, okay, that encourages faster drug approvals based on biomarkers and surrogate endpoints. Okay, this is PDUFA 6. So there's a new initiative, this is what it all boils down to, there's a new initiative to register drugs based on surrogate endpoints and biomarkers. So we don't wait for all these later endpoints and endpoints based on patients' reported outcomes and so on. That's what the 21st Century Act encourages. Whereas the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, the PDUFA 5 that is currently in operation, encourages inclusion of PRO-related endpoints to drug development. Okay, so we have 2 opposing forces, if you like. So, is there a contradiction? And I don't have an answer to this. Both were discussed at the last ISPO, and I was sort of listening to both discussions or both conversations half asleep, I guess, because this contradiction didn't click to me until like 3 days later when I was working on these slides. So it's well worth sort of thinking about it and maybe discussing later on today before we have a drink. On that note, thank you very much, and that is the end.